Good afternoon. It's great to see such a packed house. I'm Carol Doherty. I'm the director here, and I'm happy to welcome you all to the NEWHOUSE Center for Humanities to hear Pico Iyer read as part of our bi-weekly Distinguished Writers Series, a series that brings writers from all over the world into our living room here at the NEWHOUSE for a cozy afternoon of reading, writing, and talking about both. The host for today's reading is Otto Quayson, who is currently in residence here at the NEWHOUSE Center as the Cornell Visiting Distinguished Professor of Humanities. He's Professor of English and Director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. A specialist in African literature, Professor Quayson has become a leading scholar in post-colonial studies. He's the author of several books, including Post-Colonialism, Theory, Practice, or Process, Relocating Post-Colonialism, and most recently, he's the editor of the definitive 2-volume Cambridge History of Post-Colonial Literature. Born in Ghana and having lived all over the world, Otto Quayson is someone who, like Pico Iyer, likes moving around the world, both literally and through literature. Michel de Certeau has famously said that every story is a travel story because they traverse and organize places, they select and link them together, they make sentences and itineraries out of them. And I can't think of two people who are more in love with the travel story than Pico Iyer and Otto Quayson. And so I really look forward to the conversation that they'll have that we get to eavesdrop on this afternoon after the reading. So I'm going to hand things over to Otto. For those of you who are not familiar with our format, Mr. Iyer will read for a bit, then he and Otto will chat for a bit, and then we'll open up the conversation to all of you. And at the end, we'll have books available to be signed over there. So thank you for coming, and I'll hand it over to Otto.
Thanks to you all for coming. Even though Pico Iyer was born in Oxford, England, and educated at Eton, Oxford, and Harvard, his father was a professor of philosophy, and his mother was a theosophist and religious thinker. And even though he has written several travel narratives, travel accounts, and including also a study of the Dalai Lama. In spite of all this, I have a really sad confession to make, which is that for the longest time, until actually yesterday, I thought he was Canadian. Once to my shock and horror and disappointment, I discovered that he was not Canadian. I started asking myself, why did I think that Pico Iyer was Canadian? And there are two reasons for this. One is that I think that all good multicultural things come from Canada, specifically Toronto. But the other thing that struck me is that, in fact, from a reading of his work, his multiculturalism is not tied to any nation-state form. In fact, it is the process of travel itself and observation that makes his multiculturalism so resonant that I mistake him for a neighborhood, someone who lives in my own neighborhood. And I'm going to resist the really, really, really strong temptation of telling you how much I enjoyed the book and what I took from it. I'm going to resist the temptation of telling you that I am also a great fan of Greene, whose name actually reminds me of my best friend from childhood, with whom I went to boarding school together, and who introduced me to Greene. We discuss Greene even to this day. I'm going to resist the temptation of telling you how nuanced and subtle the serendipity of encounters, the way that Pico Iyer manages to extract so many profound insights from the serendipity of the casual encounters that he makes. But I'm also going to resist telling you about how he abrogates the distance, the temporal distance between him and Greene, taking inspiration from Greene, from the earlier writer, but converting that inspiration into a sense of immediacy about their mutual places in the world. Instead of telling you all this, I'm going to invite you to give a big round of applause to Pico Iyer.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful introduction. And all my life I've been trying to become a Canadian. So, I mean, I feel spiritually I'm right at home in Toronto for all the reasons you were mentioning. So you've actually given me my life's fulfillment, both in all the things you restrained yourself from saying and then said so generously, but also in anointing me a Canadian. And I can't believe how many people are here. I'm really touched and taken aback, actually. And I can't tell you just how happy I am to be at Wellesley. If you can believe it, I lived in Boston for 4 years in my formative youth, and every day of those years it seemed I was just about to go to Wellesley, and I never made it till here. So I really want to thank Professor Doherty and colleagues for bringing me here today, and for including me in the Distinguished Writer Series. No one has ever called me a distinguished writer before, and I don't think they'll ever call me one again, so I'm cherishing this moment. My only embarrassment is that as you heard, I'm traveling with this very strange and shadowy book about Graham Greene. And I actually don't recommend you try it at home. I'm like most of the people in this room. I think I'm a very enthusiastic reader, and I'm always foisting my recommendations on my friends. And I've been telling them in the last few weeks, please don't read my book, because there are so many other books that are more diverting and charming than this. This is a bit of a dark experiment, like the time I once took myself on holiday to North Korea, which is not something I recommend to everybody. But I should tell you a little bit about it, and I'll tell you a minimum, because Ato and I are going to have a conversation. But I think it arose out of a friend that I have, and many of us have this very friend, who couldn't listen to Joni Mitchell records because it seemed to her that Joni Mitchell had stolen her diaries and released them to the world. And yet for the same reason, of course, she couldn't stop listening to Joni Mitchell records. And I would come into the room, this was many years ago, and find her sitting on the floor, stubbing out cigarettes on the carpet, and listening again and again to A Case of You, or Little Green, or the older people here will remember those songs from Blue, rending songs about loneliness and love gone wrong and pregnancies with unhappy endings. And around the same time, I had another friend who identified so closely with Henry James that he barely could read Henry James novels, because he felt that James knew him so well that he was not just describing his past and not just describing right now, but actually telling his future. And he felt that if he picked up a Henry James book from 1882 or whenever, he would be reading what he was going to go through the following year. And that was too much for him. And I don't think the examples are so important, but I do think that probably everybody in this room has some such figure, or several such figures in their heads. And it might be an actor, or a singer, or a writer, or character from history, but somehow they seem to know us better than our own friends and family do. And so they become almost like shadow siblings, or like ghost fathers. And of course, that's almost, I'd say, the point of reading, which is you pick up a book, and for 10 hours you descend into the mind of somebody else. And if that person has descended deeply enough into his own being, or into that of his characters, you come to know his most intimate guilts and terrors and betrayals, as you don't even know the intimate secrets of your own parents. And of course, in the celebrity culture, every day we're reading about somebody who is convinced that he's Gwyneth Paltrow's other half or secret self, if only she would wake up to that fact. And I, like all of us, have many such people in my head, but one of them, as you heard, is the late English novelist Graham Greene, and probably most of you know him through novels like The Quiet American, or The Power and the Glory, or Our Man in Havana, or maybe through the movie, the classic movie that he wrote, The Third Man. And I could give you lots of reasons why I feel this kinship, but I don't think I would believe those reasons myself. I grew up in the same really middle-class England that he grew up, on the same road around the corner from where he had lived. And I went through the same classic old English boarding schools that he went through. And maybe because of those, like him, I never have been very good at settling into one family or one community. As you were hearing, I think like Ato, I'm constantly on the move. And in the course of my wanderings, I found my way to Havana and Saigon and Haiti and Paraguay and all these places that he wrote about so memorably. And I've always, as he was, been fascinated by the paradoxes or the complexities of faith. And yet, I think the real power of affinity lies in its mystery, and the fact that you can't explain it away, that you walk into a crowded room like this and you see a stranger, and somehow you feel as if you know her better than the friends that you came with. So as I've been going through the world, I've often felt as if I'm stumbling through a Graham Greene novel, almost as if I'm just a figment of his imagination, or as if he's scripting my life. So maybe I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of the book to give you one sense of how that works. And I apologize in advance for perhaps the political incorrectness of this, but this is just a description of one scene. I was in Saigon one autumn and had just checked into the Hotel Majestic along the Saigon River. It was midnight, which meant 10 in the morning in California, where I'd woken up, and the day for me was just beginning. I walked along Dong Khoi Street towards the Hotel Continental, a central site in Greene's novel, The Quiet American, and as I did so, I wondered how much places or people ever really change. They adopt new fashions with the seasons, lose hair, or see crow's feet gather around their eyes, and yet the girl who was once 9 years old is still visible in the grandmother of 84. Dong Khoi, or Simultaneous Uprising Street, was alive with the somewhat illicit energy I recalled from an earlier trip, 13 years before. The sound of Layla drifted up from an underground bar, and when I looked into another 60s-themed place, the Jefferson Airplane were playing White Rabbit, I saw Japanese couples sipping shyly at Lynchburg lemonades and Girl Scout cookies. Men in the shadows whispered promises of exotic pleasures, and cyclo drivers pedaled slowly past, sometimes with a young woman in their throne, sometimes stopping to ask if I wanted a friend for the night. As I made my way down the street, massage, massage, murmured the men who were standing around. A young woman on a motorbike suddenly veered in front of me, stopped, and taking off her helmet, shook free her long hair. "We go my room?" she asked. The French War, the American War, the war against the Khmer Rouge had all come and gone, yet Saigon seemed not so different from what Greene had seen in 1951. Alive with adrenaline energy and the excitement of arrival, free at last after 20 hours in a plane, I stepped into an internet cafe to try to catch the scene while it was still alive within me. "It's eerie," I wrote to a friend who'd grown up in the same neighborhood when I was 6 years old in Oxford. Fong and Fowler, out from their room on the Rue Catinat, are all around me. I can almost imagine Greene, raincoat buttoned tightly about his throat, slipping around the next corner. It's like stepping into his Vietnam novel. As I tapped away at my excited account, trying to inhale the smells and ironies to send across the waters to England or New Mexico or wherever my friend happened to be, a woman slipped in from the New York Saigon bar next door. Greene would never have called her a woman. She was a girl as confounding as any of her cousins who attached themselves to foreign males abroad, with a beauty queen face and a tigress air to her, and I was sure a keen head for numbers. She was tiny and wearing high heels, and her legs were long and shapely. Business must be slow in the New York Saigon today, I thought, as she perched herself on one of the tall stools in front of a computer terminal and began logging on to her Hotmail account. If you have a dangerous curiosity about the world, or if you're just a writer of sorts, trained to collect observations, you become, in such situations, shameless. There's a splinter of ice, Greene wrote in his memoir, in the heart of a writer, and he needs that sense of cool remove to do his job as any diagnostician does. I looked over, while deep in my message, to see what the young lady was responding to. It was, of course, a love letter from an admirer now in Germany. "Dear Fong," it began, and the immemorial cadences of half-requited love tumbled out. "You know, I could imagine my friend Henry saying, 'Greene stayed in the Majestic too.' I hadn't known. That was where he met the young woman whom he turned into Fong." Well, of course, Greene would have said, if presented with such evidence, a writer's job is to see what will happen to a stranger tomorrow. He has to plunge so deeply into his recesses that he touches off tremors that find an echo in a reader. And if he goes deep enough into the subconscious, he'll find the future hidden there as well as the past. A writer is a palmist reading the lines of the planet. 10 years before American involvement in Vietnam approached its peak, Greene was already writing about napalm bombings and describing CIA intrigue there and fumbled attempts to make contact with local proxies. The whole of The Quiet American could be taken as a questioning of men's efforts to save a world that's much larger than their ideas. God save us always from the innocent and the good, Fowler says early on, with typical, if slightly showy, Greenean irony. Half a novel later, he tells the quiet American, I wish sometimes you had a few bad motives. You might understand a little more about human beings. I look back at the real Fong now, typing out an answer to her faraway suitor in Europe. I think about you all the time, I knew she'd write, though misspelling a few of the words. I miss you. When you come back, Saigon. Then she noticed I was spying on her and gave me a long, slow smile, an invitation. I could be her Fowler tonight, she might have been saying, or her pile. A watchful English-born journalist or a naive young graduate from the New World, so eager to save her and her country that he seems certain to ensure the destruction of them both. Now, that's just one typical example, but I could go on all night, and I won't, luckily for you, of the many other instances when I found myself inadvertently shadowing Greene. I remember many years ago, I was staying in a tiny place in Santiago de Cuba called the Hotel Casa Grande, and I walked out of it one morning and I got into a car to look around, and the minute I did, a stranger got into the passenger seat and promised to show me around. And more disconcertingly still, his name was actually Faust. I wish I were making that up, but I'm not. And most disconcertingly, when I got back home, a few years later, I was reading a biography of Graham Greene. And I read that 35 years before my trip, he had been in Santiago de Cuba. And in fact, he'd stayed in the Hotel Casa Grande. And in fact, when he had stepped out of the Hotel Casa Grande, he'd got into a car to look around, and instantly a stranger had stepped in and promised to show him around. So it's clearly an abiding feature of that dubious hotel. I kept on reading the biography, of course, and at one point I found him making confession before a priest called Father Pilkington. And I remembered that the man who was my housemaster from the ages of 13 to 17, really responsible for my spiritual welfare, was a priest called Father Pilkington. And of course, it's not a very common name. So I kept on reading in the biography. And at one point, I found that in the 1970s, Greene came up with this totally crazy idea of writing a play about a very obscure 19th century romantic painter and diarist called Benjamin Robert Hayden. And I remembered, of course, at the end of the 1970s, when I was a graduate student not far away from here, I came up with this totally crazy idea of writing a doctoral dissertation on, you can almost guess now, an obscure 19th century painter and diarist, Benjamin Robert Hayden. And I don't think the connections themselves are so remarkable, but what was interesting about Greene was that he was fascinated with such connections. And when he was in his 20s and was beginning to become known as a novelist, he suddenly put aside all his fiction and devoted himself to writing a long biography of the 17th century poet and rake, the Earl of Rochester. And if you read that book now, it's a curious document because, as far as I can see, it says nothing new or original or unexpected about the Earl of Rochester. But it says a huge amount about Graham Greene, and somehow in his late 20s, by looking at the Earl of Rochester, he seemed to anticipate everything that was going to happen to him in the next 60 years of his life. Like many an eminence, too, he was shadowed for many years by a con man who went around the world doing dubious things in the name of Graham Greene. And so the writer Graham Greene that we know would open up the newspaper and see a picture of a stranger in Jamaica or Geneva or places he'd never been, and the caption would say, you know, the writer Graham Greene living it up. Or he'd check into a hotel and the phone would ring, and it would be a woman fondly reminiscing about a romantic weekend that they'd spent together, but of course a woman he'd never met. At one point, the real Graham Greene was in fact apprehended on the grounds of being the imposter, and he came to wonder if he was just a figment of the other man's imagination. And this all had a particular resonance for him because his mother's first cousin was Robert Louis Stevenson, who of course gave the world the haunting and ageless parable of Jekyll and Hyde. And I think Greene, more than most people, was conscious of all the many different people that we have inside ourselves. When he was 16, he tried to run away from his boarding school, partly maybe because his father was its headmaster. And he failed in the attempt, but astonishingly for 1920s England, his parents, in response, sent him to live for 6 months in London with a very colourful Jungian dream analyst and the dream analyst's dangerously glamorous wife. And from then on, until the very last novel he published when he was 84 years old, over and over, Graham Greene returns to this archetypal story of a little boy leaving the daylight, official, upstanding world and literally descending into a parallel underground world where there's a colourful, charming, somewhat roguish man and his mole who become his alternative parents. And indeed, his first novel ever was about the conflicts within himself, or the different people inside himself, and it was called The Man Within. So I began to think about, why do we create these shadow fathers in our heads? And how much are they a response to the real parents or fathers who created us? And I thought, well, the best way to conduct this investigation would be, in deference to his first title, to write a book called The Man Within My Head. And of course, I knew from the outset that the man within my head, haunting and possessing me, was Graham Greene. But the more I conducted this inquiry over many years, the more I came to wonder if maybe the man within my head wasn't in fact my father, or just some shadowy aspect of myself. So I'll read a little section here that speaks to some of that. Greene would not be surprised if I told him that he'd written his own life story, the only searching and revealing memoir he did write, when he was in his 20s, and thinking he was completing a biography of a man long dead, the Earl of Rochester. He had a clearer sense than almost anyone of his class and world of all the ways the subconscious is in tune with not just what happened, but what's about to come, and can write in fiction as he did in 1938 of the Indochina problem, as if knowing that it'll be a headline 15 years later, or could invent, as he did in February 1934, a dead woman found in a railway station, only for a real dead woman to be found in a British railway station 4 months later. Writing for Greene was always a form of self-examination akin to talking out one's dreams. It was also the reason he could never dismiss religion, much though his rational mind would like to. As a boy of 5, he dreamed one night of a ship going down. He awoke to learn that the Titanic had sunk during the night. 12 years later, he dreamed again of a boat sinking, this time in the Irish Sea. A few days later, he learnt that a boat had gone down that very night as he was dreaming in the Irish Sea. At least 2 of his novels arose directly from dreams, and the last book he produced was a record of his dreams, collected in diaries when young and for 24 years at the end of his life. One reason he always sought to spend the night alone was so that he could read what he'd written that day just before he slept, and then, while he was dreaming, the preconscious, as he called it, could work on the material as an outsourced accountant in Bangalore might, so that he would awaken with his narrative problem solved as he slept. I knew how this worked from the hours I'd put in at the desk. There was no magic in the process, but there was certainly mystery. I wrote once about a couple similar to one in life, but I ended my book with a couple apart. As soon as the advance galleys of that work arrived on my doorstep, the couple, who had seemed very close in life, separated. I decided one spring to deliver my next book to my editor on September the 12th, 2001, before heading back to Japan. As the planes flew into the World Trade Center on September 11th, I couldn't follow the drama that was unfolding because I was busy proofreading my novel about Islam and its quarrel with the West. Sometimes my father would pick up a stranger's hands and read her fortune by looking at the lines on her palm. I silently looked away and assumed that this was what foreigners wanted of the mystic East. But years later, my friend Louis told me that his mother had said that my father had seen things in her hand that no one could possibly have known. One day, my father stopped in the middle of a reading and refused to go on, and the young woman, so eager to hear about her future, ended up throwing herself over a bridge, disappointed in love, 6 months on. Growing up in a household with so rich and vibrant a sense of spirit spooked me at times, so I took shelter in the robust skepticisms of school. I was more than happy to close the door on forces I knew I couldn't control. But travel itself is a journey into the limits of your knowledge, as every truly alien culture shows you, sometimes terrifyingly, lines of power you'd never guessed at. In Haiti, Greene's protagonist sees the loyal soul who's become his only companion in an empty hotel suddenly turn into something else and release something dark and atavistic, primal, in a voodoo ceremony. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau rebellion, the very person many a Brit had taken as his faithful and all-knowing Jeeves began, as Greene put it, to drink on his knees from a banana trough of blood and enjoy sexual connection with a goat. And if you credit such bush devils and Catholic voodooists, and this, of course, is the heart of Graham Greene's work, then it becomes impossible to write off the Holy Ghost. It sometimes seemed that Greene was never able to discount the existence of God precisely because he believed so fervently in the existence of the devil. It doesn't stand to reason, does it, that there could be shadow without light? Now, of course, there's much, much more I could say on all of this, but since we're about to have a conversation, I'll try to wind things up now and just say that all his life, Graham Greene was haunted by a fear of seeing his house burn down. And of course, that's a very curious fear for a little boy growing up in quiet suburban England. But lo and behold, when he was in his 30s, during the Blitz, World War II, suddenly German bombs hit his home and it was reduced to ash. And he never really settled to another home again. When I was in my mid-30s, I was one day climbing the staircase in my parents' house, and I looked up and I suddenly saw that our home, was ringed by 70-foot flames. And 3 hours later, this Californian wildfire had wiped out the house and everything in it, except for me. And I began to think, goodness, these correspondences with Greene aren't quite so amusing and diverting after all. And we rebuilt our house, as most people do, on the very same property. And we were told, well, you're completely safe for 30 years. It'll take a long time for the brush to grow back. But as your laugh suggests, just a few years later, we were surrounded by flames. And then again, and again, and again. And I describe this in the book, partly because, of course, these were dramatic events that made an impression on me, but also because for the Buddhists or for mystical Christians or Islam, many people in Islam, all of life is a burning house. And when I write about my own life in this book, I'm trying really not to write about me so much as something metaphorical that applies to all of us. So I'll just end this portion of the program by reading something from that section. There were fires raging all across the hills around our house, and I was sitting in a downtown restaurant with my mother and my wife, Hiroko. I'd flown into Santa Barbara 2 days before, and driving along the empty road that leads from the airport to our house 10 minutes away, I'd looked up into the hills to where the lights of our home shine alone on a ridge, and my heart had stopped. There were 2 bright blazes of orange cutting through the darkness with a speed and efficiency I remembered from the time when our house in the same location had burnt down with me beside it some years before. I accelerated wildly up the hill and started taking the curves along the mountain road leading up to our solitary house at a crazy speed. The air to the north was already red and full of smoke, and as I pushed the car to go faster, I saw sightseers along the side of the road gathering to watch the unearthly light show. Great towers of orange 100 feet high rising from the valleys just below our house, and the smoke turning the sky into a sickly pall. I swerved, brakes screaming, into our driveway and summoned my wife and mother out to see what was happening a mile or 2 away. It looked to be remote still, but I remembered that during the previous fire, the flames had raged through the brush at 70 miles an hour, so that an orange gash in what looked to be a distant slope was suddenly a pillar of flames arcing over our living room windows. The next day, we awoke to the sound of helicopters whirring overhead. The sky was a grisly, blood-red color. The house felt hot already, and although the smoke seemed to clear as the wind shifted and returned us to a placid blue midsummer day, as the afternoon went on, the sky above the ridge next to us turned a hideous end-of-the-world color, or discolor, really, ash falling around us like snow. I went with Hiroko down to the post office, and as we came out after a short transaction, the whole suburb around us was black with coffee smoke. We looked up to the hills to where our house and our far-off neighbors were, and all we could see were 1, 2, 3 slashes of orange angrily starting up across the slopes. We began to drive home, and switching on the radio, I heard that our house and the few up the road had been issued an evacuation warning. I turned into our little road and began driving up it, and the announcer on the local radio, frantic, said that the evacuation warning had been turned into an order. We had to leave now, or we would be forced out. We drove the remaining 5 minutes at a crazy speed again, collected my mother, her dazed cat inside a little cage, gathered as many precious papers and photos as we could in 5 minutes, and then tore down the road again, fire trucks coming past us in the opposite direction, plumes of smoke seeming to rise from all the valleys and the crevices in the hills, the air so thick we were choking already, and driving out of what seemed to be an oven, the huge flames cresting above our house as if ready to engulf it. Now, barely 20 minutes away, downtown Santa Barbara was dreaming through another quiet blue sky afternoon, a miracle of calm. The angry smoke and orange burns to the north seemed to belong to another universe. We had to go about our life as usual. The next day would bring a fireworks display along the beach for July the 4th, and the day after that I was due to perform a wedding ceremony for a college friend who was flying all the way over from England for the ceremony. There's a story of the Buddha, my mother began telling us now, perhaps to take our mind off the conflagration, and I listened to her, though usually all the wisdom that came from her, a teacher of comparative religions, I tried to block out because I was a son. When his closest disciple, Ananda, asked him what was the greatest miracle, she went on, walking on water or conjuring jewels out of thin air, changing the heat of one's body through meditation, or sitting undisturbed in a cave for years and years, he said, simply touching the heart of another human being, acting kindly. That's the greatest miracle of all. Ah, the Church of Humanity, in other words, I piped up, like Greene. I didn't care that I was citing the very writer my mother had liked when I was at school, and I had mocked. You remember, she said, not unexpectedly, who it was who told you to read Greene. It was what he always believed in, I went on, the human predicament, the possibility for kindness and honesty even in the midst of our confusions and our sins. He could never quite bring himself to believe in God. God was the other with whom he played his incessant games of he loves me not. But in humanity, he had the strongest, if most reluctant belief. In our fallenness lies our salvation. The other two looked at me blankly, nonplussed by this explosion. But what I really could have been saying was that we were now in the world he'd made so real to me in his books, at the mercy of much larger forces, pushed back to essentials, without a home. The only thing you could possibly do in such circumstances was see that so many others were in a similar predicament and reach out towards them. What you shared was not faith usually, but unsettledness. Up in the hills, meanwhile, the fires continued to blaze. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Pico, thank you very much. It was a wonderful reading, and of course, some of there's one passage, the first passage in particular, also struck me when I was reading it. But I'm going to ask a slightly different question before I come to. There's some repeated feature of the book that I'm curious about. But the first question I want to ask is about a certain, what I think may be fundamental difference between you and Graham Greene, and is that in Greene's novels, which may be different from his life, I haven't read his biography. In most of his novels I'm familiar with, the central character labors under a sense of loss of religious belief. Catholics. Yeah? However, the doctrine has been separated from sentiment. They retain the sentiment, but they disavow the belief or the doctrine. You find that in definitely in the heart of the matter, in the power and the glory, and perhaps even in an attenuated form in the Quiet American. So there's doctrine or belief have been severed from sentiment, but they disavow the doctrine but retain the belief. Unfortunately, the belief also becomes a motivating factor for certain crucial decisions that they take. At certain critical times, the sentiment is what gets them to, like the priest in the power and the glory, deciding to stop instead of run across the border, to stop to give the guy to absolution, and so he's captured. Now, this odd, shall we say, a problem of belief severed from sentiment, which we could name it as a form of agnosticism. But I think that the word agnostic or agnosticism is too simple to capture the complexity of it. What I wanted to find out is that where are you at in terms of the relationship between belief and sentiment? Because I suspect that the way you've configured belief versus sentiment or belief and sentiment might be quite different from Greene, precisely because of your mother, for example. Your mother and your philosophical father. So it's a question about a question of the spirit. Where do belief and sentiment lie in your bosom?
What a wonderfully searching question. It's a real luxury to be talking to somebody who reads so brilliantly and thoughtfully. And you're right, because Greene called himself, as you know, a Catholic agnostic. And he said, just as you were suggesting, that he had faith but not belief, that he had the emotional readiness to surrender to something larger than him, but he can never get his rational mind around it. And maybe a bit of that speaks to me. I think one of the things that moves me about Graham Greene is that I always sense that kindness was much more important to him than doctrine. What you do is more important than what you believe. And I read recently a famous physicist in Princeton saying, I'm a practicing Christian but not a believing Christian, which is an interesting distinction. And I think Greene would fit that. Just as you said, the whiskey priest, if any of you have read The Power and the Glory, you remember he's a priest who does everything terrible. He drinks, he has a mistress, he doesn't begin to observe the text of Catholicism. But in the crunch, as Arthur was saying, he gives up his life to administer Mass to somebody and reaches out to the people who are suffering, and in some ways acts more heroically than a saint or a pious priest would. And I suppose I'm attracted to that. One thing I share with Greene is that I've never been comfortable in sitting in any category, whether it's a country or a faith or any kind of, even this book doesn't sit within any genre. And like you maybe, but certainly because I grew up as a little Indian boy with an English voice and an American green card, now living in Japan, I felt that none of those places could begin to comprehend the whole of me, and that I would have to make my life almost trying to create my own categories and then to blow up those same categories. So I think Greene was a believer who refused to be a member of any group. And that it's interesting that some people say that he had all the terror of a religious believer with none of the joy. He never, Christianity was never a consolation or a support for him. It was only a source of guilt, and he felt pursued by some administrator of justice. And he almost seemed to need to believe in God, because he needed to believe that he would be punished for the bad things that he did. So you're absolutely right, I don't go with him that far. But the sense that there's some spiritual logic in the world, even if you don't commit yourself to a single body or doctrine, I suppose that's attracted me as somebody who can't or hasn't been able to lay claim to any single belief system so far. And I was going to say something else about that, but I've forgotten.
Well, the next question has to do with the Fung passage. In your
I was hoping you'd forget about that.
No, because in both that one and an earlier passage where I think you're in Mexico on a bus, and a woman walks up to you and offers herself as a tour guide. And you spend some time with her. It's touring. She's telling you things, and at the end of the evening, she's making suggestive moves that there might be possibilities after the tour. Which and it's interesting that that you mention in that moment of the offering and your attempt, your rejection. You mention, I think the first time, or maybe the second time, you mention your wife.
Right, it's the first time. Yeah.
It's the first time. Yeah. The first time you mention your wife, and then also you mention that the woman has 2 children.
Yes.
Now it's a tantalizing moment of what if.
Yes.
But you repeat the same formula with Fung.
Yes.
The Fung girl over whose shoulder you are, the one that you read.
Yes.
Now this is quite different from Greene, at least in his novels.
Right.
Because in his novels, it is actually, we've just spoken about the priest who has affair, and then the quiet American. Or in his novels, there's not so much hesitation and undecidability. Yes. Now, my question is that is this your normal formula? No, seriously, because you repeat it.
Gosh, it's lucky my wife isn't here.
Is this your normal formula, or is this a way of crafting a certain represented self? Is that what you really do in real life? No, I don't mean it that in such a banal way, but the fact that you raise the option
that's
more than once and then take it back. So I was wondering whether there was not something deeper going on.
Well, let me tell you the truth. I love the phrase represented self because you're right. When I've told many of my friends that this is neither non-fiction nor fiction, but I tell them there's a picture of my father and me on the cover of the book, but I tell them if you're expecting to learn anything about my father or me, you won't, because this is in some sense a manufactured self, or the self that I need for this particular inquiry. The two parts, two ways of answering your question. The first is I think Greene was a sinner manqué. He always horrified even those people closest to him by talking about his casual affairs, which has always made me suspect he didn't have so many. And that in fact he was a schoolboy most of his life who was actually rather apprehensive about the world and therefore affected a swagger and confidence that he didn't really have. And the fact that he stresses those relationships suggests how much he in fact wasn't enjoying such relationships. In terms of me, I think what I'm fascinated by, and one of the things that really draws me to Greene, is what I would call riddles of kindness. And so Greene described in great detail and prophetically, as I said before, the conditions that he found in Haiti and in Cuba and Vietnam and many other places. But what I think really lasts is that I sense his stories are really allegories about something that most of us have faced, which is you're walking down a foreign street and a stranger comes up with a hand extended. What do you do with that? And of course we face that all the time in Wellesley and Boston and elsewhere, but it's so easy to sleepwalk past that in our regular lives. Whereas travel brings you up with great immediacy, to use your word, against these moral and emotional challenges that often we don't know how to solve. So with the woman in Bolivia, she's a kind woman and a friendly woman, and she's interested in more conversation because, as far as she's concerned, I'm a millionaire who's suddenly been airlifted down into her life. And if Richard Gere were to come into this room now, I'd want to be his friend for the same reason. Who knows what doors would open to me that would never be open to me otherwise. And it must be said there are a lot of males in the same position in this book. I describe it at great length. When I was in Havana, my first morning in Havana, a man came up to me in the street and said, "Let me show you Havana." And he was so interesting and cultured and kind, I gladly gave myself over to him. And then 2 hours after our meeting, he said, "Well, how about you give me your passport, I go to America, start a new life there, you go to the intersection, get a new passport, and then everybody's happy." And I didn't take him up on it, but I couldn't respect myself for not taking him up on it, because I was thinking, I'm living in a position of privilege and mobility and ease. He's in something akin to solitary confinement. What would be so terrible for me to actually engage in this and help to liberate him in some ways? There's no justification for not doing this, even though I didn't do it. And so I like the fact that travel really keeps you in this place of moral unsettledness, where whatever you do is going to be the wrong thing at some level. I describe the last of those towards the end of the book is when I'm involved in a terrible car crash in Bolivia with an old school friend of mine, and he's in hospital and the driver's in hospital, and a woman is very, very kind to us. A local woman who's a nurse goes out of her way to give us advice and to help us get to a better hospital and to make all the flight arrangements, and just selflessly gives herself for 24 hours to making sure that we can leave her country. And just disinterested kindness. But of course, the day that I got back to California, the emails started coming from her saying, you know, "I'm in Bolivia and this is a difficult country and I'm impoverished. Please, can you do something to help me?" And of course, you would want to help in those circumstances, but you wouldn't know what the best or discerning way of helping her is. So in that sense, maybe in those two instances in the first 2 chapters of the book, it's less the sexual aspect of it that I'm interested in than the moral aspect, which is an innocent person wants you to help, and what do you do? Given that you're such a person of privilege, you can go to their country, but they can't come to yours.
Final question, and then I'll open it up for questions from the floor, is that this has to do with Graham Greene as a kind of avatar of yours. You know,
It's a great word.
or precedent, or let's.
I like
so
avatar.
Yeah, it's a kind of an avatar.
Yeah,
You know,
that's great.
but because in a way, it's a little bit eerie or uncanny. The idea that somehow you. Your life is a chronicle foretold by another
Right.
in writing. You know, it's a chronicle foretold by another in writing. Of course, that may also be just because you yourself are a writer. So that in fact, it is only another writer that can produce or generate a chronicle of your life foretold. Or it is that actually you are a traveler. Graham Greene was a traveler. He went to many places. That in fact, you have been on a quest for form. That is to say, to produce a kind of formalization of what is essentially a series of feelings, sentiments, and ephemeral observations. And that it is he who has, in a way, produced that form beforehand. So it is you who are kind of miming him. So of course, suddenly everything that he does or does not do, even chance symmetries, seem to you to have been foretold. So my question is, how much is your avatar actually a product of your own quest for form? And how much is it a real spooky, symmetries and similarities? So is it your quest for form? Because as a travel writer, your life is essentially formless, and he gives you that form. Or is it really, in which case, we should all be looking for form? Yeah. So that's my question. How much is you?
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting because the way you were describing him is just the way a believer describes a religion. So you and I walk down the street and something happens to us, and if you're a believer, you say that's God or Allah or the Buddha or whatever. And if you're not, you say that's an accident. And so I guess I'm a believer in Greene because I am investing him with the power to foretell my life. I'm saying that it's not a coincidence, but he's crafted that. Now, that said, I feel strong affinities with others who are not writers. So like probably most people in this room, there are musicians who, for 40 years, when I listen to them, I think that is so uncannily close to my experience, which is what they're aspiring to do, of course. They're speaking for me and for millions of other people. At one point, I feel a strong sense of identification with the singer Leonard Cohen, though of course he's a writer also. And I, at one point in this book, had 10 pages about the correspondences and how Greene and Cohen were really indistinguishable people, and what's going on in these types that makes me so fascinated with them. Luckily for everyone here, I cut those pages out of the book, but I could have done a similar book about Leonard Cohen or about filmmakers or whatever. But in terms of the writing, and because that's such a beautiful question, I think Graham Greene lives most strongly in the minds or hearts of those people who travel. And I've noticed that in California, say, my friends who haven't traveled much, they've probably never read Graham Greene and never want to read him. But my friends who have spent time in any place, especially in the developing world, say that when you're trying to catch the sensation of a foreigner alone in a foreign country, not able to read the signs, not really able to tell right from wrong, not knowing what's going on, and unable to orient himself, the one person who's really got that tremendously is Graham Greene. And I think that's why, although his novels were written 60 years ago, many people other than myself find ourselves in Graham Greene situations. And one eerie thing when I was writing this book was I discovered 7 or 8 other writers who had felt possessed by Graham Greene. Some men and some women, but disproportionately. So I often think that there are other contemporary writers to him, Aldous Huxley or George Orwell or Evelyn Waugh, who in many quarters are more highly regarded than Graham Greene, and yet somehow he has a gift that they don't have for getting under your skin and invading the soul of the reader and making you feel. I think he had a great gift for intimacy on the page. And somehow many, many people feel possessed by him, often demonically possessed. There's a chilling novel called The Devil's Own about a young writer in London who writes an article, and suddenly he receives an invitation from the aging Graham Greene to go and visit him in the south of France. And he goes, and the Graham Greene figure gives him a manuscript and then dies. And that poor young writer turns into Graham Greene. He takes over his house, he takes over his young mistress. Every time he writes, he hears a phantom pen scribbling in the distance, and somehow Graham Greene has literally taken possession of him. And what seemed to be a dream, which is that he got an invitation from Graham Greene, turns into a nightmare, which is that he loses himself, and he gets inhabited by this guy, this stranger. Time magazine, I don't think, is a great source of wisdom, but when Graham Greene died, their obituary writer said, "No writer more thoroughly shaped and invaded the 20th century imagination than Graham Greene." And I think that invaded is brilliant. It's the best word I've ever read in Time magazine, because they're suggesting exactly what I'm saying. He had some quality for getting inside you that maybe more accomplished writers didn't. So again, in that sense, I don't think I'm so particular. And one thing I was going to say in answer to your first question, not that it's very relevant, but there's a book I just read that is coming out by Alain de Botton. Some of you may have read his books before. Next month, and it's called Religion for Atheists. And his point is that he's a non-believer, but he feels that all the religions of the world have great things to offer us in terms of solace and guidance as we struggle through suffering and loss and death. And that the secular world somehow hasn't been able, in its shorter period perhaps, to come up with the brilliant rituals and ceremonies and traditions that Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism have for dealing with the fact that your mother just died or your lover just disappeared or whatever. And it's an interesting way in which he's, and it goes back to your first question, as I say, he's enlisting the devices of religion without the formal imprisonment of a single religion, to say something in the human spirit longs for that. And therefore maybe that's the reason many people relate to Greene, because they want some sense of order in the world or protection or justice, but they're not always ready to subscribe to a formal doctrine.
Of course, there's another name for religion in a secular world, and it's called Macy's. Anyway, thank you very much. So now questions from,
And
I'm sure.
Maybe I'll...
Yes. Yeah, maybe you
It's
can,
easier
yes,
so I can
yes.
see the faces.
So he'll
Oh,
you
yes,
take
please.
them, yes.
Okay.
In Sleepless Nights, in Elizabeth Hart's Sleepless Nights, she has a wonderful sentence about travel. She says that the first thing that happens when we travel is that we lose ourselves.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I've always taken that in both a literal sense when I travel, because I get lost quite frequently, and then the metaphorical. And,
Yes.
and it seems to relate to much of what you were saying. But what I would love you to comment on is really the difference between fate and coincidence. I recently read a sentence and it said, I don't believe in coincidence, but I believe in fate. What would you and what would you have to say?
So the question was about losing yourself in travel and distinguishing between faith and coincidence. And in
Fate.
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 Fate. Oh, I was going to take the easy question, which I've already answered, about the difference between faith and coincidence. You know.
Let's talk about your fellow Canadian, Leonard Cohen.
Well, I'll take the first part. So I've always traveled to lose myself, and you tell yourself it's only by losing yourself you find yourself, but in practice you lose yourself and sometimes find nothing. But I like that existential challenge, and I like the fact that when I'm at home, I'm to some extent straitjacketed by my beliefs and my assumptions, and I know myself, I feel, and I know how my days are going, and I feel on top of the world, in command of the world, and as soon as I'm in the street in Haiti or India, I'm lost, and I know I'm at the service of either coincidence or fate or the gods or devils or something, but I can't begin to control or anticipate a single thing that's going to happen. And I think that's a tonic reminder and a humbling reminder of how small we are in the larger picture of things. And so I'm glad to lose myself, because when you're traveling, I think the point of travel when you go to a foreign place is to find foreign places within yourself, to find unvisited or little suspected corners of yourself, impressions, sensations that you didn't know you had. And in that sense, you expanded, even if you're learning that you're more terrified than you knew, or that you have intimations that you didn't know, or that you're suddenly moved when you're sitting on an Icelandic hill and the wind is whistling through against your ears or past your ears. You find something that maybe you never could have found at home. So thank you for that. In terms of fate and coincidence, just off the top of my head, it sounds as if one is pointed and one is arbitrary, clearly. And so I think it's not, I think believing in fate and believing in faith is actually not so different. And I think, therefore, my answer would be a little akin to what I was saying to Atto, which is two of us walking down the street and a rock falls and one person says, that's fate, it was meant to be, and another says it's just one of the myriad things that happens every day. I live in Japan, as you know, and my adopted home suffered the earthquake and the tsunami last year. And I've been interested that I've heard much more panic about that and about the radiation in California than I ever hear in Japan. And my friends have been asking me, are the Japanese unperturbed by it? And of course, many of them are very perturbed, but many are not. And for example, my wife, I was recently in the radiation area and with her in the tsunami area, and we just had a grandchild born 2 weeks before the tsunami, not so far away from the tsunami. And so I said, well, are you worried, do you think? And she said no. Because more or less she was saying, this is karma. We can't organize all the events in our lives. And I could remove her and bring her down to a safer area and then she could get hit by a truck. Or who knows, we have no sense of what's going to happen tomorrow. And when I heard her say that, and I don't know if she would probably define herself as a Buddhist, but what I thought was that she has a very acute sense of fate, which is essentially a sense of faith, which is that there's something organizing our lives, whether you call it God or nature or fate or providence, and that actually allows her to accept and embrace reality much more than other people would, who thought it was coincidence, and therefore not to be fighting against reality, but to assume that whatever is the dispensation, these are the cards we're dealt, and we work with them, but we don't sustain ourselves with the illusion that we can control too much. But anyway, it made me think about fate. It made me think really about your question and see that she and I think many of her Japanese neighbors were actually getting strength from the fact that they believe that there are no coincidences.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, you placed at least part of Greene's rootlessness to his house burning down, perhaps, or perhaps he was rootless and that belief in the future that it would happen as part of it. But I wanted to ask you about being sent away to school, which happened to me much less than it happened to you, but I remember, since you remarked it, feeling disconnected from the world, feeling I understood less about it than others, and like a bluster about how much I knew. And I think both you and he were sent there very young. Where do you think possibly that kind of isolating environment and the ability and the necessity to kind of attempt furiously to make sense of what became a bewildering world when you emerged from school set you both on that kind of course?
Such a good question again. And the question was about how much being sent away to school maybe defined me and made me feel close to Greene. And there's a huge amount about boarding school in this book. And it seems arbitrary, except that I think it's the core, because it's such a formative or deformative experience. But certainly it changes you for life, that sensation. And I'm mostly, and by the way, thank you, I liked very much what you said about rootlessness, especially when you said that maybe it was his anticipation of losing his house that made him rootless, or maybe that was a wish fulfillment of a kind. I think he never would have been happy in a home. And in fact, when the fire finally did come along, he seized the opportunity to be without an official home for the rest of his life. And towards the end of his life, he said, actually, my problem is not that I'm rootless, but that I'm restless, which was an interesting distinction. But to go back to the school, yeah, so I was born in England, and my family moved to California when I was 7 years old, and I began going to school in California. But my teachers found that I was somewhat advanced in certain ways, because I'd already begun learning, as I was saying to Carol, Latin and ancient Greek and lots of those things in the second grade, and that I was also very retarded in others, and they didn't know what to do with me, and they put me from one grade to another, week by week. So the disorientation of suddenly being in California after Oxford was acute, and even more because they literally didn't know how to place me, and I didn't know how to place myself. And so when I was 9 years old, I worked out, and this was 1966, that the dollar was so strong against the pound that I could actually fly back to England, go to the school that I'd begun attending, because it was a boarding school also, and fly back to my parents 3 times a year, and I could do all of that for less money than just to go to the local private school in Santa Barbara. And so I convinced my parents to let me take off from the age of 9, so I went 6 times a year back and forth between my father's house, my parents' house, which was in 60s California, where the students were burning down literally the Bank of America down the road and razing to the ground all foundations of society as we knew it, and this opposite world, which is really Graham Greene's world, which is a boarding school set up in the year 1440, where we had to wear full morning dress to class every day. We had to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin. It couldn't have been further away from California. And as I say in the book, it was almost like going back and forth between a city of history, where there's very little space for hope, and the city of hope, where there's no space for history. And I remember first, every time I went back to California, I'd become a bit of a hippie. And every time, of course, I went back to England, I'd become something of a skeptic. And then, being a crafty little boy, I realized it's much better to do it the other way around, and to become a hippie when I was in England and a skeptic when I was in California, because in those days, most little English boys had one dream in life, and that was to be a Californian, because, you know, center of the revolution, endless summer, long horizons, no past. And so many of the people I knew in California seemed to long for the groundedness and the sense of continuity and the order that England has in abundance. So I do think that really that process of moving back and forth formed me for life, to the point where maybe that's the reason why I never felt I could belong to England, and I never felt I could belong to California, but I thought really where I belonged was in the passages between them, and in the movement back and forth, and in the combination of these two very disparate places. And what I've found, I guess my prejudice is that in this new century, especially if I come to a university like this, so many of the students I meet are much more international than I am. And they have one culture associated with their parents maybe, and another with their boyfriends, and another with where they happen to be right now, and another with their dreams. And their whole life is going to be about taking pieces of different cultures and stitching them together, and that home is a sort of work in progress, and is something that they never complete, but it's an evolving thing, and it has to do not with a fixed place, but with the combination of cultures that out of which they're weaving their life. So I certainly came away with that sense, and that distinction, and watching how California dreamed of England and England dreamed of California certainly has defined most of my writing, because it's largely about the crossing of cultures and the way that they project their hopes or dreams or illusions upon other cultures. In very practical ways, I think I'm very grateful to boarding school, because it made my relations with my parents much better than they were otherwise. Because as I was a restless 15-year-old, where many people are at home and fighting against their parents, I was off in the hands of professional sadists who had who had only one gift in life, and that's managing 15-year-old boys. And they were professionals. That's all they did. They knew exactly how to handle that. And my parents were liberators. So I was always so excited to see my parents, and they were the ones who, rescue me from school and allow me to stay up late and take me to movies, and they were associated with holidays. And I think that was a very healthy thing, actually, to delegate boyhood rebellion to places that know how to deal with it. The schools have their shadow points, but I think probably the best influence so far in my life has been that boarding school one. And it's probably no surprise that when we read travel writers today, still a disproportionate number of them are products of those English schools, because the conditions are so harsh, the food is so horrible, and the hostility is so intense that if you're in Afghanistan during the war, living in a cave and eating stones, you say, oh, this is what I was trained to do. I've done this for 10 years of my life. And so I think there's a distinct relation between travel and boarding school, at least in my experience. So for me, the debt outweighs the anxiety. Yes, please. Yes, the gentleman with the glasses first, or with the grey coat. Oh.
Philosophical and practical question. I'm speaking to a group of 12 people from Morocco in March, and the whole thrust of the travel is to do exactly what you were talking about, is to learn about who we are, what's the new self, and how can we learn about the new self by looking at respond to what we see in Morocco. However, there are some tinges of danger in this, possible riots and blah, etc. What is my role in trying to both allow to create this space for people to have these individual adventures, while also being mindful that I've got to I have to protect people too. And so I feel there's a certain kind of conflict between both inviting people to be themselves and learn as much as they can in travel, but also protecting them too, important to.
Yes. Can I ask, are these students that you're taking?
They're people over 50.
Oh, well, that makes a significant difference, I think. Because I would say in a place like Morocco to really err on the side of caution. I think Morocco is a scary and unsettling place, and it's very easy to get caught up in that kind of cauldron of chaos there. I associate it, it's very similar with my parents' India, where to some extent it's observing a very different logic from the one that we recognize. And you can find yourself in a kind of altered state in some ways. I mean, I would certainly read lots of Paul Bowles before going there to prepare yourself for it and to prepare the people that you're taking. But I'm glad they're not students, because there I would be quite wary of going to Morocco. And I think if they're people over 50, then you can really afford to set them loose much more, because they've experienced a lot of challenge and unsettledness even at home, I'm sure. The token piece of travel wisdom that I'm sure you know already about Morocco is that as soon as somebody comes up and says, I want to be your guide, say yes, and then nobody else will. If you say no to him, for the rest of the day, one person after another is going to try and claim you as his victim or accomplice or whatever. But as soon as you've got one, the others know to leave off. And there are other rules like that that you can almost gauge intuitively about how to negotiate what's literally a kind of lightless bazaar or very difficult labyrinth. But I think the one virtue of being over 50 is one can be loose in Morocco as one couldn't when one was 20 probably. Good luck. I mean, for the same reason, I think Morocco is one of the great countries in the world. I've only been there once, and I've been longing to go back because it packs such a punch, and it's such an intense place, and such a devouring place, and such an exotic place in those ways. So I was just actually wrote a long piece about Edith Wharton's book in Morocco, and it made me fall in love with Edith Wharton because it's so impressive. There she is in, I think, 1918 as a 55-year-old woman, often alone. First thing that happens to her is her car breaks down in the middle of the desert, and when most of us would fume or get anxious, she says, wonderful, I can now enjoy the long views. And Morocco for her is a sensual wonderland, and she catches all the colors and the textures and the smells. And I think, again, your travel is mostly created by the spirit that you bring to it. It's like the difference between fate and coincidence. And in that sense, if you can bring that kind of openness while not being indiscriminate to the place, hers might be a good book to read also, because she's so enthusiastic and receptive, even though ostensibly much more imperiled or in much more vulnerable position than most of us would be. And of course, in a Graham Greenian way, when I said the gentleman with glasses, I noticed that both the gentlemen with hands up there had glasses, so I wasn't actually saying anything. But the other gentleman, please.
Away from Mr. Greene for a second, could you give us a few words about Dalai Lama and some adventure in North Korea?
Well, those are very different worlds, of course, almost polar opposites. To start with the Dalai Lama, when I was talking to Atto about what you said, I think, about the sentiment without the belief, or other ways that we formulated it, of course, one of the things I was thinking about was the Dalai Lama, whose most recent book is called Beyond Religion, and who actually first he disarms people as the world's most visible Buddhist, probably, by the fact that when he comes to our country, the first thing he says is, please don't take up Buddhism. Please stay within your own tradition where your roots are deepest and there's the least danger of misunderstanding. So that's an interesting position. And now, in his most recent book, he clarifies his feeling that people don't need religion. I mean, it's wonderful if they have it, that's a great luxury, but the first thing is to think just about kindness and responsibility to the people around you. And he sometimes uses the analogy of tea, and he says, we all need water to survive, and that's how he sees secular ethics: kindness, responsibility, thoughtfulness. Religion is like the tea bag. It's a wonderful thing that makes the savor of life different and particular and whatever, but tea is not a necessity, but water is. And so I think, it's no coincidence I wrote a book on the Dalai Lama and then I wrote a book about Graham Greene, because I see them converging in that position of saying, think about your responsibilities first before trying to put a name on it or to put it in some kind of ideology. And I won't, again, I could go on about the Dalai Lama for a long, long time, but I've been lucky enough to know him since I was 17, so I've been talking to him and traveling with him for a long, long time, and every year he comes to Japan for a week in November, and I travel by his side for that entire week, and I sit in on all his closed-door meetings and everything he goes through, and the more I see of him, the more I'm impressed by his alertness and his compassion. The most recent example was that, in fact, I alluded to it before. Last November, as soon as he arrived in Japan, he wanted to go to the area hit by the tsunami. So we went there, and it was a harrowing scene. You still 8 months after the event, you saw cars floating on water and pieces of washing hanging outside houses whose first floor is entirely gutted. The second floor is totally intact. So you see a whole suburb with no first floors, but the second floor is exactly the way it was before the tsunami. Telegraph poles teetering over, and there was one little temple that had survived the tsunami, although in front of it the graves were all keeling over and bent from that attack. And there were large numbers of people gathering in the road because they were so happy to see the Dalai Lama come and visit their fishing village that had been wiped out. And as soon as he arrived there, he walked over to them, as always he does, and started, blessing them and just looking at them and holding them and giving what he could. And he said, please don't, and the women were all sobbing, and the men too, were sobbing and saying, thank you for coming. And he said, please don't cry, please give something more constructive to those who died, and please think about the future. You can't do anything with the past, but you can do a lot with the future. And please rebuild your community just as your country did so heroically after World War II. And obviously they took heart from that. And as he turned around, I noticed that he actually had tears in his own eyes. And I thought, well, that's probably the definition of a wise man, which is to feel absolutely the loss and really emotionally to experience everything that they had suffered, and yet also to be able to give the larger picture and the rational, logical, useful advice that they could take home. And then he sat in the temple and he began to talk to them. And I wasn't expecting it, but he said, well, I know a little bit about what you've gone through, because I was in Lhasa one day in 1959, and suddenly that day I was told, you have to leave. So within a matter of hours, I had to lose all my friends and my small dog and say goodbye to my life that I'd known for 24 years. And then he also explained that while he was fleeing Lhasa to safety in India, 2 days after he left his hometown, he heard that all the friends he'd left behind him had been killed. So it wasn't just that he'd physically left them, he'd lost them for good. And he has that great gift for finding a point of common humanity with everybody he met. So even these people who had lost their relatives, and of course much more than that, he said, well, I have nothing to offer you except the fact that I've been through the same kind of thing, and I know a little of what you're going through. North Korea, as I say, is sort of the opposite. I was walking down the street in Beijing once in 1990, and I saw a building with 14 pictures of Kim Il-sung outside it, so I brilliantly deduced that this was the North Korean embassy. And I went in and I showed them my British passport, and they said, we don't enjoy diplomatic relations with Britain. Come back in 3 days and we'll set you up with any tour you want and of our country. And they were as good as their word. I came back and they set me up for 3 days, very thoughtfully. They even provided me with a guide who spoke the Indian language of Urdu, but unfortunately I can't speak a word of it or any other Indian language, so his expertise was wasted on me. But it was it was the most eerie place I've ever been, because it's so isolated that I realized that they couldn't begin to conceive of a room like this, or people like us, or our lives like the ones we enjoy. And if you can't imagine the other, you're much more likely to be brutal towards it, and that was terrifying. It was also the only place I've been which looks identical to photographs. At least the part that they showed foreigners is really a Potemkin city. So you might as well be walking through a blueprint in somebody's imagination. So I remember seeing they were building the largest tourist hotel in the world, 101 stories high, for a country that of course doesn't really accept tourists. They'd built huge Olympic stadiums, although they've never held the Olympic Games there. There was an enormous Arc de Triomphe, which my guide pointed out in impeccable English was taller by a few centimeters than the one in Paris. They're beautiful roads, but completely carless, and with one lane in the middle reserved for the president's car. So it was really a surreal thing. It was really like walking through the mind of Kim Il-sung when he had fashioned this, in some ways impeccable on its own terms, new country. And I never saw North Koreans moving individually in the street. They only moved, as kindergarten kids do here, in great groups with a leader. And it's the only country I've been in where I knew that no North Korean, I could sense this, would want to make contact with me. Because if I were to walk down the street and there was a North Korean person there, the consequences for encounter with a foreigner would be so dire that they would run in the opposite direction. So in that regard, it was very, very different from anything I'd seen. But what struck me also was that within its own terms, and if you know nothing about the rest of the outside world, they've built something rather extraordinary there. And my guide, who had spent 3 years in Pakistan learning Urdu, so he'd had a taste of the world outside North Korea. My last day, he took me up onto a hill overlooking the capital of Pyongyang, and he said, "Look over this." And he told me, "Please don't recite my propaganda. Please, when you go back to the United States, don't tell them what I've told you. Just look at this and just see how in the rubble of the Korean War, in less than 40 years at that point, we've constructed this flawless, spotless, completely modern city." And if you look at it in those terms, they have done something amazing, and their degree of discipline is extraordinary. Of course, the conditions have changed in certain ways for the worse since then, in terms of hunger and the like. But I'm guessing if you were to go there tomorrow, you'd see something quite akin to what I saw.
Can we take one last question?
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same.
Oh, okay.
Oh, here.
I was really sorry that you're taking out the Leonard Cohen portion.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you identified with Leonard Cohen in the same way that you did with Grant Greene.
I probably mentioned that about to tantalize you, and so some editor would request that I would resuscitate. Yes, maybe so. Well, Cohen has always been a vagrant in some ways, a gypsy. From his first record in 1967 or 68, he was defining himself as that. And in his first record, he was talking about the competing pulls of the world and faith in some ways. I think he says it's hard to hold on to somebody who's reaching out for surrender or something like that. So in those ways, I think he converges a lot with Graham Greene, and it's been many years since I wrote the pages about them, so I may have forgotten quite a bit of it. On the one hand, he commands one with his sense of wisdom, and you feel here's a man who's suffered a lot and who's thought about his suffering and has actually come to a real understanding of the rules and the laws of human existence. On the other, he always portrays himself, of course, as a sinner, 2 in the morning with a bottle of wine and confused and drunk and tormenting or betraying the people around him. And that's an interesting correspondence with Greene. And Leonard Cohen, many of you probably know him, especially if you're my age or older. He's famously an ordained Zen monk, but he observes all the ceremonies of Judaism. And not so many years ago, he suddenly found an Indian teacher in Bombay that he was going to consult. So I think he has that allergy to being fixed, and he refuses to be placed in any category. And when he worried that people were beginning to see him as a kind of New Age sage, he called his group the Army. He always used to say, "I'm an anti-vegetarian." You could feel his restlessness with whatever notions people were trying to project onto him. I mean, I could say a lot of wonderful things about him, one of which is I've written a lot about Leonard Cohen and the Dalai Lama precisely because they're both monks in the middle of the world. And what I so admire about them is that it's relatively easy, I think, to be clear-sighted and calm and pure if you're on the top of a mountain. And it's relatively easy to be stimulated if you're in the middle of Times Square. But for me, one of the central questions has always been, how do you bring that clarity and calm to the thick of the real world with all its confusions? Of course, Graham Greene is attempting that too. But I think both Leonard Cohen and the Dalai Lama move in the very real world, in the Dalai Lama's case in the political world, which couldn't be more cutthroat, in Leonard Cohen's case in the world of Hollywood and the music industry and things that are not the most exalted of circles perhaps, but how you can act in those with such humility and generosity and grace and wisdom. And I think both of them bring to these not so enlightened places the fruits of what they have collected in silence. So you probably know his most recent album came out 2 days ago, so this is a good time to be thinking about him. So thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
I'm really honored by your questions.
Thank you.